Awesome. First of all, my name's Scott. I'm a member of exec here at HCFA. And I wanted to come up here to introduce the speakers, but also give a little intro. So the first part of that is we're just singing about Jesus at the center of it all. And we come here in this space as Christians and we worship and we praise the living God that we believe in and that we want to give honor to as He's given us more than we can possibly imagine. We want to reciprocate that. But we also come to this space, like the MC said at the beginning, to commune, to challenge, and to change. Right? To commune with each other, but to challenge one another also and to change this campus. And so what you've seen us doing and what exactly is tried to be intentional about over even the past couple weeks and going forward is thinking about, okay, we have this faith, this thing that we believe in, this understanding. We're saying we want to put Jesus at the center of it all. What does that actually mean? And what does that look like when we go out of these doors into the world with all sorts of social issues, pain, problems, things that we run into every day? So that's why we had race in the gospel. That's why today is about race, poverty, and abortion. And in the future, we're going to be talking about other issues too. So we're really excited. We think these are really important things. It's not easy. We understand that, and we want to be conscious and aware of that. So we'll be open to chat afterward and going forward. But we think that this is a really important space for us as Christians to say, how then must we live, right? How then must we live with that faith that we have? Amen. So we're super excited today to welcome two Harvard graduates, Dr. Jackie Rivers and Reverend Eugene Rivers, up to speak. Jackie Rivers is a lecturer at Harvard University, executive director and senior fellow for social science and policy of the Seymour Institute for the Black Church. Reverend Rivers has been an activist for over 35 years, recognized nationally and internationally as one of the most effective crusaders against gang violence. There's so much more for me to say here, but I'd rather just welcome them up and allow time for them to talk. And also, there's going to be a time for discussion and questions. So please, as you're listening, make sure to write things down, think of good questions to ask.
So I'd like to thank Scott, and can you all hear me or do I need the mic? Very good. I'd like to thank Scott and the rest of the leadership for engaging with this topic and for giving us the opportunity to come and talk to you. I know we're talking about leadership, race, poverty, and abortion, but I also want to remind you of something that we were talking about with several of the students over dinner earlier. We are God's ambassadors. And one of the most disturbing things that I found as an undergraduate at Harvard, and that I heard recently in a major sociological study, is that evangelicals look just like everybody else. We look just like everybody else. That in fact, this major study, so when I came to Harvard, I came just having become a Christian and convinced that the whole purpose of being a Christian was that Christ reordered my priorities and turned my life upside down. And that just being like every other Harvard student and going to Harvard Business School, even though I suddenly saw that I could go to Harvard Business School and I could be wealthy with very little effort, was that what God was calling me to do? Or was He calling me instead to go live in Dorchester, in a crime-ridden, poor, underserved neighborhood? And this major sociological study, or political science study that's coming out, that shows that white evangelicals do not conform their politics to their faith, but rather they conform their faith to their politics. What makes white evangelicals vote for Trump? Their faith or their politics? I don't think the black church is immune from the same problem. I don't think we look very different either. I challenge you to turn your back on all that's calling you here at Harvard. Turn your back on the allure of wealth and power, on the desire to conform and just fit in. Turn your back and focus on Jesus. What is he calling you to do? Be the light of the world.
Say it.
Let people see him shining in us. We, the church, I feel as though we have disgraced him, that we shame his name because we just look like everybody else. And if we just look like everybody else, then why don't we just go ahead and be like everybody else? Why are we pretending if he doesn't really transform our lives? Let him transform our lives. Be a witness to the world. Be a witness to old people like me who've been in the battle so long. Let me see your light shine. Remind me that he transforms lives. Let me see him transforming you. And so I thank Scott. I thank the leadership for inviting us to talk about a place in which I think we really have room to show leadership as a church, room for us to demonstrate that we are not simply just like everybody else. So, social justice, Black Lives Matter. Young people across the country are standing up by the thousands to say that Black Lives Matter and to protest the extrajudicial killing of young black men by police officers. It's an important issue, and it's encouraging to see young people galvanized to stand against injustice. But, you know, as Christians, we have a really deep call to stand for social justice. Black Lives Matter didn't make that up. It didn't start with them. Because in Matthew 25, verses 34 to 40, Jesus says, "Then the king will say to those on his right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?' The king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'"
Say it.
Whatever you did
Amen.
for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. One of the things that encourages me in my faith walk after 40 years is to go back and to read the witness of non-Christian historians of the first century who said that the Christians, they knew there was something different about these people because of the love they had for each other, the care they took of the poor. Their lives testified to the presence of Jesus. Their lives said, "We have been transformed. We have been changed radically." And that's what we as Christians today are called to do, to be radically changed, to exercise leadership. So leadership doesn't just mean jumping on the bandwagon. I'm not asking you all to go out and join Black Lives Matter. I mean, there's some problematic themes in Black Lives Matter, which are counter to Christian values. But what actually leadership means is going against the tide. It means being different. If you're going to stand up and lead, you can't lead if you're just joining the crowd, right? If you're just following everybody else, that's not leading. Leading means that you are going in a different direction, that you're following the direction set by the Holy Spirit, that you're following the direction that Jesus calls you to follow. And so I want to talk about two issues of social justice where I think our leadership is needed. Black Lives Matter, they're focusing on what the police are doing to young black men. But you know, the real danger to young black men is other young black men in the inner city. Young black men, homicide is the leading cause of death between young black men between the ages of 15 and 34. Homicide. Young men killing each other. And so for men between the ages of 15 and 24, roughly 60%, 48%, I beg your pardon, 48% of them die from homicide. If you look at young white men in those two age groups, 15 to 24 and 25 to 34, the rates are more like 3 or 4%. And if you look at the total number in 2012 or 2014, 4,500 young black men died from homicide across the country. If you look at extrajudicial killings, maybe we get up to 6. 4,500 young black men. That's a place where Christians could really exercise some leadership. That's a place where we could be in prayer, because I'm not asking you to just, I'm asking you to seek what God is calling you to do. I'm asking us to think and pray about what God is saying, not just to get up. I'm asking us to study the problem, not just to get up and come up with our own plan of action, half-baked. Another area where our leadership as Christians is really needed is in the area of abortion. So, I remember many years ago going to a Radcliffe leadership seminar and engaging with some of the women there about the topic of abortion. And I expected to hear that everybody believed that abortion was okay because human life didn't begin at conception. To my absolute shock, these women who defended abortion were quite happy to admit that human life does begin at conception. And the science really supports that. See, if you think about the transformation, right? The forming of a new organism. Well, in scientific terms, and I'm going to butcher this because I'm no scientist, but let me just tell you roughly, right? In very laywoman's terms. What you have to have is that you have to have a fundamental change in the structure and function of the cell. So what you start out with is an ovum, which doesn't have all of the necessary chromosomal information to form a human being, and a sperm that doesn't have all of the necessary information. But when these two cells meet and merge, now you have what is a self-directed developmental organism. You have an organism formed. A human being is formed at that point. And the latest point at which science might argue that this happens is at a point called syngamy, because this doesn't happen initially, it happens within 24 hours, when the nucleus of the ovum and the nucleus of the sperm become one. There's no point after that, no scientific point at which you could say that there's a transformation where now you have a new cell with a new structure and a new function. One of the things that points to the change in function is that the ovum, prior to the meeting with the sperm, is designed to attract sperm. But once sperm and ovum have fused, a protective coating comes around that ovum, which actually repels any further sperm, to protect the viability of the organism, of the human being that's been formed. And I think it's important for us as Christians to stand up and say that life begins at conception. And if you need the scientific background, you need to do the research. Let me refer you to a book by Robert P. George and Chris Tollefson called Embryo. And they don't come at this from that book is not arguing from the perspective of faith, even though they're both Christians. It's really arguing from the perspective of the science and the philosophy, and making the case that life starts at conception. If life starts at conception, or at the very most in scientific terms, within 24 hours, what does abortion mean? It means that you're ending a life. So if we're weighing a woman's choice versus the life of a baby, as Christians, we should be willing, in loving, tolerant, kind, understanding, and generous ways, to stand firm in saying that abortion is wrong. And I don't think anybody in here would make the argument, I'd never personally commit murder, but who am I to tell you not to commit murder? I don't think any of us would accept that argument. Why should we accept that argument for abortion if in fact it is ending a human life? Why should we say, I'd never personally choose abortion, but I am not in a position to tell any woman what to do with her body. I'm not in a position to tell her what to do with her body. But I should encourage her not to kill a child, not to take the life of another human being. I should encourage that. I don't want us to do this lightly or without compassion. It's a very difficult position to be in. Have a child that you don't think that you can take care of. It's a very difficult position to be in. And unfortunately, the numbers in the black community are overwhelming. We are roughly 14% of the female population. We account for almost 40% of the abortions in the country. 14% of the population, almost 40% of the abortions. I don't think black people know that. I didn't know that. I don't think black people know that. I don't think black people know that for every 1,000 black babies born, roughly 365 are aborted. So that's almost 1 in 4 of all, well, there's also a fudge factor because they're natural, they're natural terminations as well. But somewhere about 1 in 4 black babies conceived are aborted. Data from the Center for, that actually data comes from the Guttmacher Institute, which is the leading think tank on abortion. But it really requires us as Christians to bring very deep understanding and empathy to dealing with the situation. Because probably the chief predictor of abortion is poverty. It's poverty. And there are a couple of factors involved there. So, over 70% of all black babies are born to single mothers. 7 out of every 10. 70 out of every 100 black babies born to single mothers. That's difficult. If you are a woman who already has 2 or 3 children out of wedlock, you're struggling to raise them, and now you're pregnant with your 4th or 5th, it's hard to take that child to term. Our job as Christians is to approach that mother with compassion, not just to be pro-birth. Not just to be pro-birth. You have to have the baby, but after we wash our hands and we're not prepared to stand with you through the next 18 years when you are responsible for this child. We as Christians have to be saying, we are going to advocate for, work for you, support you in the tough job you have of raising a child. No, in this age of rising economic inequality, when you're trapped in poverty, we're going to stand with you. But we also need to think about solutions, right? So, the work of Isabel Sawhill shows that, I need to say that this trend in out-of-wedlock births is across the board. It's not just in the black community. The black community is the highest. Back in 1965, it was 25% of black babies that were born out of wedlock, and that ignited a huge controversy because Senator Daniel Patrick, no, he wasn't senator at the time, he was Secretary of Health and Human Services. Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote the infamous Moynihan Report, which probably none of you have ever heard of, but it really created a firestorm because he was saying that the government needed to act and provide jobs for black men so they would get to stabilize the black family and reduce out-of-wedlock births. But that's not the way it was read when it was released. He talked about, I see you shaking your head and rolling your eyes. He talked about tangle of pathology. He used extremely derogatory language. But what if in fact that report hadn't been moved and jobs had been provided for young black men and black women had had men to marry and some of this would have been forestalled? 25% of babies, 1 in 4. 70% of babies, 7 out of 10. What is more, the social science shows that it's actually detrimental to kids to grow up in single-family households. It is detrimental to kids. Multiple reasons, lots of factors. One of them is increased likelihood that women will grow up in poverty. Children will grow up in poverty. Isabel Sawhill says that what we need to be promoting is a mantra. Finish school, get a job, get married, then have babies. Finish school, get a job, then get married, have a baby. She says that their research indicates that if that happened, and Sawhill is a fairly liberal scholar. She is not a conservative by any stretch of the imagination. And she's saying that if we could get young people to follow that sequence, 2% of them would be poor. 2%. Now, I'm preaching to the choir, because the data shows that you guys are going to follow that. You're going to finish college, probably go on and get an advanced degree, get a job, get married, have children. College-educated women, increasingly of any ethnic group, are the only ones who are following that plan. Everybody else is increasingly, I mean, not just the poor, it started with the poor, but it started with black people, it spread to the poor of all ethnicities, it's moving its way up the class ladder, it's now common in the middle class to have children out of wedlock. It's detrimental, and you know what happens? It's a vicious cycle. So it goes from generation to generation, getting worse and worse. The privileged people, the privileged few who are having children in two-parent families, their children are privileged and continue the cycle of privilege, get more and more privileged. The underprivileged who are having out-of-wedlock children, their children are cycling down, playing into the growing economic inequality that already exists. Where are we as Christians on this? Where are we as Christians on this? Where are we as the representatives of Christ, the light of the world, on this? It's a mantra we can take up, but with compassion. With compassion. You know, don't want to sound like a liberal and talk about blaming the victim, but we don't want to blame the victim. We want to recognize that people's choices are severely constrained by the extreme economic inequality that exists in the country, and still, one, defend the gospel, stand up for the defenseless unborn child, but two, point out that it is in the interest of the individual and of their children that they adopt Salt Hill's mantra of finish school, get a job, get married, then have children. That's what I want to ask us to do personally, to think about how we as Christians can get involved, very compassionately. The other thing that I think is important as a part of that is advocating for, especially in this time, our voices are needed more than ever, especially white evangelicals who supported Trump. More than ever, our voices are needed to advocate for the resources that are necessary to improve education for the poorest people, to provide job training, and to provide employment. Those are not simple problems to solve, but you are the best minds in the country. We are the ones who should be engaging how do you solve those serious social problems. In an age of growing technological advances, how do you provide jobs? Or is this the time to talk about a guaranteed income? What do we do about unemployment in an age of growing inequality? Our minds are the ones that should be engaging that question. Those are the questions we should be working on. We should be advancing answers. And I would say one other thing, coming back to the issue of high rates of homicide among young black men. I would encourage us to study the problem because that is a much tougher issue to solve. I can tell you about what Salt Hill has found. I should also add that she also advocates for LARCs, long-acting reversible contraceptives. She's like, young women are drifting into having babies, not just poor women, but young women, they have sex. They're not using birth control, and the science shows that it's hard to actually exercise the discipline to use birth control, and they get pregnant, and they didn't mean to, and something like 70% of babies conceived are actually unwanted. And she says, so what we ought to do is put all of these young women on long-acting reversible contraceptives. I'm for contraceptives, but I really wonder about the shift in the culture, the level of irresponsibility that we are encouraging to simply say, go ahead, have all the sex you want, just make sure that you have a long-acting reversible contraceptive, a LARC, and it'll be all good. So I don't want you to think that I'm an unqualified fan of Isabel Sawhill, but what I was starting to say is I can point to her research and say, look, here are some directions for trying to address the issue around abortion laws. That we need to get young women involved, poor young women, involved in some kind of career track. Because the data also shows that the more invested a woman is in having some kind of career, the less likely she is to have a child out of wedlock. Less likely she is to get pregnant in the first place. So a lot of young women, according to Kathy Eden and Mary Cathalis, a lot of poor young women are looking to motherhood as a means of finding an identity because they're just drifting through life. We need to get them involved. We need to address the issue of education, job training, employment, so that they have a future, they have some reason to delay childbearing. But at least there's research I can point to on that. There's precious little research being done, probably because it's the third rail of scholarship, on why young black men are killing each other. So I point you, first of all, those of you who are sociologists or economists or psychologists, I encourage, something to do your thesis work on, and when you are PhD students, your dissertation on. But I encourage you to go read Jill Leovey. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name correctly, but I think it's Leovey. Jill Leovey. Ghetto-cide is the name of the book. Her analysis of what happened in Los Angeles, the amazing levels of homicide. She points to one of the, in her eyes, one of the major culprits. Now, in my view, Jill Leovey kind of lionizes these white cops. I'm like, I'm a little uncomfortable with that. They're not Superman. She got a little carried away there, it seems to me. But the point she makes is that only 61% or under 60% of murders are actually cleared, which means someone is either arrested or identified as a suspect who can't be arrested because perhaps that person is now dead, the suspect is now dead. 61%. So it generates a kind of hopelessness, the expectation that the cops are never going to solve my son's murder or my brother's murder, so I need to go out and I need to avenge my friend or my brother, which encourages a cycle of violence. She provides evidence that this doesn't happen just in poor black neighborhoods, but has happened in other societies where poor, cast-off people lived, and young men died and their lives were not taken. No one took up the case for justice for them. Go read her book. Study the issue. Because we need to do something to change what's happening in poor black neighborhoods. To send a message to young black men that their lives are valuable and that there will be justice when their life is taken. And I understand all the complexity of that, which she describes. I mean, I'm not trying to suggest that that many of these young men are not themselves involved with crime. That doesn't mean that their lives are worthless. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't have justice. Study her work, engage the issue, and let's see how we can rebuild trust in law enforcement agencies, how we can get these law enforcement agencies to prove themselves trustworthy in poor black communities so that we can really make a difference and so that Jesus shines through our lives in these issues of important issues of social justice. Thank you.
Praise the Lord.
Praise the Lord.
Praise the Lord. Now, I know y'all can do better than that. You know, I appreciate the Hillsong, is that the one out of Australia? Is that Hillsong? Yeah, I appreciate y'all Hillsong thing, right? That's gonna rock that Hillsong thing, right? You know, ain't a whole lot of heart funk in that, but that's okay. Praise the Lord. Amen. I want to thank Scott for his courage. We presented at one of your conferences in Connecticut, and the Holy Ghost told me to burn the house down. And so I got my matches. I said, we're going to go in on this thing. Amen. 100. Right. Well, I'm thankful to the Lord. And I took my meds this morning. And I actually prayed about this. And I asked the Lord, I said, well, Lord, I don't want to waste these people's time. And what would you have me say? And the Lord gave me 3 verses of Scripture for y'all to meditate on and think about. This is the Holy Spirit talking about. And the reason the Lord put this on me is sort of based in an experience I had in the hood some years ago, where I went to church. I'm Pentecostal, Church of God in Christ. We the high octane wing of the low church, right? So y'all had a worship service, but you ain't seen it full throttle. Amen. We full throttle with that thing, right? I mean, we be bringing it. So I praise the Lord. This was a very, praise the Lord. I got it, right? It wasn't quite that hard funk, right? I said, that's okay. I'll take it. I'll take what I can get. Praise the Lord, right? Now, and there was an experience I had. I was leaving my Pentecostal church, Friday night service. Because we had church all week. Amen. And no shame in the game. And I don't want none of you folk in here, none of my folks, to be embarrassed in front of these other people. That's what we did. We went to church. We loved Jesus 7 days a week. There was no shame in the game. There was no, oh, I don't want those people. No, we was in it. 100. and loved God, and God blessed us. Now, coming out of church one Sunday, there's a poor man on the street. And we've been praising the Lord. We going in on it, right? And so the old man on the corner, who we were about to step over as we went from having a high time in the Lord, like y'all had it tonight, to going out to get something to eat. That's the thing church people do. You go to church, wear it out, work up an appetite. If you're in the South, you go to dinners. Amen. Right. And you have yourself a good time. And the old man said something I want all you Harvard students to think about. He said, if you go to church to feel good, but your feel good does not do good, you are on drugs, and your religion is a narcotic. You're just getting high to help work out whatever the angst and existential crisis you have from day to day, which can be managed by your coffee or some pills. If your faith, Harvard, that makes you feel good, so you have a worship experience, and it's worship light, it ain't worship deep. Your worship light experience does not inspire you to do the will of God. You are engaging in a narcotic experience where you just felt good to get high, but you did not do good and rejected God's perfect will for your life. Anybody mad at Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or McKinsey? Somebody say amen up in here, right? Don't